And he says, why don't you get treatment? He goes, well, I can't afford healthcare. Well, why don't you support Medicaid expansion? And he flat out says, well, if I do that, then these Black and Latinos will get access too, and we'll become a socialist country. And I would rather die than become socialist. I mean, dying to own the libs is literally what he's doing there.
All right. Well, Qasim Rashid, it is, I got to say, truly an honor to have you. I discovered you, I think, on Threads initially, found you on Instagram and was like, wow, I love what this guy is saying. I would love to talk to him. And he seems kind of out of my usual circle of just like contacts and people that I tend to follow, which I love. So I had to get you on to talk. Thanks for making time. It means the world.
It's a privilege to be here, Tim. Thank you for having me. Love your content as well. It's always exciting to see people of faith recognizing that faith should be led with compassion, not a bludgeon. So I appreciate that about you.
100% agree on that. Why don't you, for really my sake and the audience, give me some of your background. Where are you from originally? What work do you do now? Give me all that stuff.
Sure. I was born in Pakistan and we migrated to the U.S. when I was about 4 or 5 years old. So raised in the U.S., lived in the Chicagoland area for the majority of my life, went to law school in Virginia. So I was there for about a decade. Moved back home about 3 or 4 years ago, back where I grew up. So it's exciting to be back home. I'm a human rights lawyer, and so I work on civil rights, human rights cases, supporting women who are survivors of domestic and sexual violence, religious freedom issues, civil rights issues. I also work with a law firm that does a lot of business stuff too. I work a ton with nonprofits and startups. And I try to stay pretty active in the social media landscape to continue to advocate for a sense of humanity and justice in the work we do. I'm married to my wonderful wife, Aisha, of nearly 17 years now.
Wow.
We've got 3 amazing kids and just living the dream, man.
Yeah, I love that. What got you into the field of human rights work as a lawyer? I mean, was it something that happened just looking at the society around us? Give me the background there.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks who are lawyers have a story that, I was at the dinner table and I was arguing and that's what I knew. And that I have that.
The
that's
call
not my
came
story.
to me,
Yeah, no, and that's not my story at all. I actually did not have any intent of being a lawyer growing up. It was my wife who encouraged me to go to law school after we got married. And I think it was, sometimes your better half knows you better than you know yourself. A lot of times, I think. And I was working in corporate America when we got married, and she saw I was miserable in doing that work. And as I was contemplating getting my MBA, was pretty honest that this is going to be a terrible decision for you. You don't really find joy in making money. You find joy in the community organizing aspect of it. And that's where she encouraged me to go to law school to pursue that aspect of it. And she was right. I mean, it's made a huge difference. And in law school is where I really found my passion for these issues that we're talking about. I think the other part of it is, when you're a 19-year-old brown bearded Muslim, when 9/11 happens, you suddenly become the spokesperson for all 1.6 billion Muslims, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And it was important to me that I have the tools and the platform to be able to write my own narrative, one based in facts and reality, as opposed to the misinformation and disinformation being spread out and about. So it was kind of a fusion of all these things that motivated me and that keeps me going in this space.
Yeah, I grew up a conservative white evangelical, and I grew up on a steady diet of talk radio, which meant that when 9/11 happened, I just heard nonstop from your Sean Hannity's, your Rush Limbaugh's, right, about the threat, right, the Islamic threat to America. And, reflecting on that now where I am, I just think about how insane all that rhetoric was, how extreme it was. And I'm just wondering, for you as someone growing up in America during that time, I mean, it had to be just so difficult and frustrating and infuriating to see your faith consistently misrepresented by these people to, stoke Islamophobia.
Yeah. And it was done for the sole purpose of making money. I remember I was actually on Sean Hannity's show maybe almost a decade ago.
Wow.
And
gosh.
And it was about the threat of radical Islam. And I spoke to him offline. I'm like, Sean, this is all nonsense, right? This is all crap. He goes, yeah, I know, but it's just entertainment.
Wow.
I'm like, so you admit there's no rhyme or reason to it? He goes, well, I mean, there's a little bit, but no, it's entertainment. And I think people know it's entertainment. I'm like, no, they don't. They actually believe you.
Yeah.
And people's lives are being destroyed. He's like, oh, you're being melodramatic.
Wow.
And so it really, and I talked to his producer, he told me the same thing. So it's an act, it's a show for them. It's not, they live in a different reality. They don't actually understand the impact they're having. I will tell you
Wow.
that the vast majority of folks that I've had the one-on-one conversations with are very, I don't want to say easy to convince because that sounds simplistic, but they're open to having a dialogue and understanding the misinformation and disinformation. The problem is, that one-on-one conversation takes time and it's not very efficient. Whereas you've got someone, like these pundits going on and speaking to tens of millions of people.
I know.
It's a quote. It's so funny because this quote is attributed to Mark Twain, but it's not actually even his quote, where he says, a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is putting its shoes on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're dealing with here. But that's all the more reason why we need to be more active and engaged, and why I love these kinds of opportunities to dialogue with thought leaders like yourself, because I think it helps build a more cohesive narrative of compassion in our country that we need right now.
Yeah, and look, I mean, as someone who was steeped in that world, homeschooled, I mean, grew up deeply embedded in what we might call now a Christian nationalist space. Even though I myself was not really super radicalized yet, I was on the path. I just feel an obligation to say I'm just so sorry. I mean, I feel like a lot of my work I see now as my act of repentance, of churning and going the other way, not from necessarily intentional harm that I've caused, but harm nonetheless that I've been complicit in, whether I knew it or not. And I do think about more than ever, especially as we've seen right-wing media find a new generation of personalities like your Matt Walsh's, your Candace Owens, your Charlie Kirk's. It's only gotten so much. I mean, they really make Hannity and Limbaugh look tame many times.
Oh,
and,
absolutely.
And it's so frustrating to watch, in particular, the Christian faith. On one part, you could argue this is very Christian. There's a Christian stream that is complicit in this, but also watching it become weaponized and watching it become so hyper-politicized towards right-wing causes. To people like me, it's why I do this work. It is infuriating to watch.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you apologizing, but to be very honest, Tim, I mean, you have nothing to apologize for. You're leading by example in what I would argue is Christ-like behavior, and the fact is, people do better when they know better.
Yeah,
and I always try to meet people where they are, and I appreciate that about you. I think the other thing I'll add is this is the danger of infusing state and religion.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is one of the big dangers of it. When you have theocracies, or when you have, whether it's a theocracy in South Asia or the Middle East, or whether it's this, attempted, Christo-fascist theocracy, it's either trying to make over here. There's no scenario where a theocracy works. You need to have separation of religion and state. Let people worship however they want to worship or not worship. That's none of my business.
Right.
My business is to make sure that every person has access to food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, clothing, these basic necessities of life. And I often tell people, if your faith doesn't prioritize service to humanity as its top initiative, then it's a fantastic waste of time.
100%.
It's a lot of things, but it's not a faith.
Yeah, I agree. So, maybe break down for the audience what a human rights lawyer does. When I think about human rights lawyers, I think about people who are like, I'm forgive the ignorance, I'm ignorant here, but you're at the UN, you're in front of the Supreme Court, you're like, this is a human rights violation, whatever it is. Is it that grandiose at times? Is it much more local? What is it like being a human rights lawyer?
So it's a range of things. It's just like saying, what's it like being a lawyer? What's it like being a doctor? There's a range, right? I've got a friend of mine who's an ophthalmologist, and people will come to him and ask him questions about their heart or some cardiac issue, and he'll be like, "Well, I'm an eye doctor," and they're like, "Oh, so you're not like a real doctor then?" And he's like, "Well, the eye is an organ," and so they feel offended. And so with attorneys, right? There's litigation attorneys, there's transactional attorneys, there's a wide range. There's absolutely human rights attorneys like Amal Clooney, who will work with the UN and the International Court of Justice. Karim Khan, who's prosecuting Hamas and Israeli war crimes. That's certainly one level. Where I've worked primarily has been on immigration law, supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence, restraining orders, representing people seeking asylum before immigration judges. I stopped just recently working on a case, but we were working on a case supporting a church community whose ancestral cemetery was taken and sold by the state, and the cemetery destroyed. So seeking restitution for that.
Wow.
So it's a wide range of things. I work extensively with nonprofits. I just finished up working with a nonprofit for the last 2 years, working on protecting reproductive health access and abortion care. I mean, there's a wide range of things. I like to kind of define it as somebody who is working where their primary focus is not a business or transactional aspect of it. I would define, I've got a friend of mine who works he's an attorney, and he works on lobbying Congress to expand SNAP and TANF, to expand food stamps and cash assistance for people who are low income. I consider that human rights law, because you're ensuring people have basic access. I have another friend who works on a startup to ensure people have legal access or legal counsel when they're pulled over by law enforcement. I consider that human rights law, because you're appealing to the basic necessities of what a human being needs to live.
Yeah. Let's talk about immigration for a minute. It's not every day where I get to talk to an immigration lawyer who's done work in that realm. And again, so much of what we hear through news sources, really all kinds, can have their own bias, and we just don't get the full picture. I mean, what do you make of the current situation happening right now with the topic of immigration in America? I hear, of course, one side, unfortunately, using that to repeat truly KKK level talking points of the Great Replacement theory, right? That's low hanging fruit. Then you have these other more nuanced perspectives of, hey, okay, well, we obviously want people to come here who are, don't want to do ill will, but we also want to make sure that we have a good immigration process. But it seems like, and please, let me just say, correct me if I'm wrong about anything. Just say, Tim, you're wrong. Here's what's going on. You have full permission. But it seems like no matter if you're a Republican or Democrat and you're in federal office somewhere, we can't get this immigration thing solved. I've heard rumors that, hey, Joe Biden tried to get one of the most robust immigration bills passed that was super conservative, but Trump tried to stop it behind the scenes, and he did. What's your take on all of this? Like, is immigration just a political talking point used for folks to try and get elected? Can we actually, quote unquote, solve the problem? Is there a problem to solve? Give me your take. I'm so curious.
This is honestly, to have a thorough discussion, you need an entire separate podcast for this, but I'll try to synthesize it in 60 seconds.
Okay.
We've never had a just immigration policy, ever. The quick history lesson, obviously, everybody knows that America's founding was on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans,
right,
and the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
After the Civil War, you started to have the first forms of non-African trafficking and non-European immigration. While you had basically open borders from Western Europe, you had a restriction on most anyone else, including on Asians, Africans, South Americans, etc. The kind of turning point was in 1877, when there was the anti-Chinese massacre, when 500 white Los Angelinos attacked Chinese Americans. Why? Because they're taking our jobs. Sound familiar? And they killed about 18 or so Chinese Americans. Nobody was held accountable. Congress responded by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So just to put this in perspective,
please take your time.
Chinese Americans were murdered, and Congress said, you know how we solve this? Let's just ban Chinese people altogether. That was extended to the Exclusion Act of 1892, 1902. By 1912, it became the Asiatic Exclusion League. And by 1924, in fact, May 26th, just last week or so, or a short while ago, was a 100-year anniversary that the immigration ban on all Asian immigration was enacted by law and passed by the Supreme Court as well. That stayed on the books until 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 as part of the Civil Rights Acts that were passed. So now, 1776, even 1619, basically to 1965, you basically had a ban on all non-white immigration. Meanwhile, by and large, you had open borders for white European immigration. Post 1965 is the only time we've had any semblance of a justice-based immigration system. And even then, it doesn't account for the atrocities committed before then. Right now, where we are, and finally to get your answer, to answer your question now, is where we are is we have Republicans who have decided we don't want immigration, period. And it's a very terrible idea because it's going to destroy us economically for a number of reasons we could talk about.
Sure.
And we have Democrats who seem to think that, hey, we can win over Republicans if we just try to act like them. And it drives me nuts because it's just not the way it works. And Democrats do this repeatedly. The crime bill was a Republican idea that Democrats passed to prove how tough they were. It was a terrible idea. And even this immigration bill that Joe Biden tried to pass, the Republicans themselves kiboshed, is an extremely conservative bill.
Right.
I will give credit to President Obama in 2013. He actually put forth a very good bipartisan bill that was much better than what Biden just put forth now. Republicans kiboshed it back then, and they're kiboshing it now. Republicans claim government doesn't work, and then they get elected and prove it. this is kind of where we are right now. It wasn't a great bill, but the solution, and I'll close my rant with this, the solution is a three-part solution. One is we need to invest heavily in immigration judges and attorneys at the border. Asylum is a human right. We can't just turn people away. Two, we need to make massive investments in the worker visa program. There are about, I think, 4 to 5 million migrant jobs that are left vacant, that only migrants take, that Americans don't take, that can be filled by migrant workers who are seasonal. In fact, this was an idea proposed by one Ronald Reagan, of all people, and said we should have open borders for these people to be able to come, work, and go back. And finally, we need to recognize the impact of climate change in our U.S. foreign policy. There's a great map you can Google about every country that the U.S. government has intervened with to overthrow and to mess up their economy. It's basically every country in South America. You can't overthrow a country and then be surprised when people leave that country for greener pastures. So it's a fusion of things. But I think what we're talking about now of investing more in immigration judges, of investing in a more competent visa worker program, of ensuring that DACA has a path to citizenship, these are very easy, simple things we can do that will have a massive ROI.
Yeah, I just discovered, shows my own ignorance, the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee. They're different things, completely altogether. Different reasons altogether. So that's good to know for my audience. I just learned that yesterday. And the other thing is, I was actually at a pastor's gathering in my area talking about this in a very compassionate and healthy way. And the person who was presenting mentioned climate change being one of the main reasons for immigration. I never knew that, realized that climate change is one of the biggest contributors to people leaving, their home or whatever it is to find a better place. Can you expand more on that by any chance? I'm just curious if you know any more insight to that.
Look, you can Google this right now. Mexico City is supposed to run out of water in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Which
I'm sorry, not to fact check you, but I'm going to look this up. Oh my goodness.
Check it out.
I will.
And that should concern people because, the annual drought's becoming more and more severe. Wow.
February 25th, CNN, one of the world's biggest cities may just be months away from running out of water. And that was a few months ago. Wow.
Yeah. That's a problem, right? And now you extrapolate that across the entire global south, the equator area, the fact that, where every year is a record-breaking temperature hike. Climate change is having a big impact. And this is why when we talk about climate justice, it's not this, right-wing caricature of people hugging trees. This is about economic, social, and climate justice. Meaningful climate justice means you're investing in green economies. It means you're recognizing the impact that climate change disproportionately has on Black and brown communities and taking active measures to ensure that you mitigate that harm. The fact that countries near the equator are suffering higher degrees of drought and heat due to actions by countries like the United States and China north of the equator should tell you how, unfortunately, those who are causing climate change are not yet suffering the major consequences of it. If the United States major cities are running out of water, you better believe there would be mass movement to protect that or prevent that from happening. But because we're not feeling the effects of our own actions, we're slow to act, and we're at the point of climate denial, which is, again, catastrophic for our short-term and long-term future.
Wow. Yeah, I hope the audience is really soaking that point in. I mean, no pun intended, because it's things that I just don't see, I don't hear about, and then all of a sudden someone like you comes on and goes, "Yeah, did you know this, by the way, about Mexico City? It's not like 10 years from now. This is like weeks away.
It's here,
right? It's here now." Yeah. And does it frustrate you? And please, I mean, just be honest. You don't have to agree with me, but it drives me crazy to hear, in particular, right-wing media pundits and others spin this narrative that, climate change is a hoax and it's just a big push for power by the globalist elites and stuff, when in reality we can see the effects. I mean, listen, I live in New Jersey. Okay, I've been here my whole life, East Coast guy, and I've noticed this shift even in weather during the summer, where we used to never have tornado warnings or tornado watches. Now we get multiple a summer where one or two might actually touch down. When I was a kid, that was not a thing. So even I can see in my local area how weather patterns have shifted. Yeah, it's got to drive you bonkers, especially being someone who advocates for this stuff legally, to see how this rhetoric really affects legal policy that stops us from making real progress.
It does bother me, but I'll tell you, Tim, what bothers me more, and this is, to quote Dr. King from his letter from Birmingham jail, where he says, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute understanding from people of ill will." And so you've got these right-wing nut jobs who are like, climate change is a hoax and, we're just, making it up. But then you got people on the left, and I'm talking about politicians who recognize how devastating climate change actually is, but will still take money from Exxon. We'll still take money from Shell and BP. We'll still want more drilling. We'll still want more fracking. And it makes me pull my hair out, because my point of view is, extremely well that this is devastating our climate, that is causing higher rates of cancer. It is disproportionately harming low-income people, Black and Latino people, Indigenous people. And knowing full well that there are better alternatives, you're more committed to the same oil companies and fossil fuel companies that the right wing is being funded by to deny climate change.
Right.
How are you any better? In fact, to quote Dr. King, you're worse, because you know better. And despite knowing better, and this is why, going back to the point you made earlier, tying it back to like the Christian nationalism aspect of it, like I do have concerns for people who have been radicalized by the Sean Hannitys. But what bothers me more are the Sean Hannitys who know better, but still continue to radicalize. And not to compare people, left-leaning politicians, to Sean Hannitys in every respect, but on this thing, I think we need to call out an injustice for what it is. If you know better and you still continue to commit injustice, well, shame on you. That's one of the, and so that's what I'm trying to fight, because I think if we can get those folks to simply uphold a sense of justice and integrity, these ideas are popular. Climate justice is a popular idea. People recognize it. It's just, conservatives. Many of the conservatives I talk to are conservationists as well. They love the outdoors. They love hunting. They love fishing. They love boating. These are all things they love doing.
Right.
And they see the erosion of the soil, of the wetlands, of the shores. They get it. And if Democrats, if people on the left would just, recognize that these are not only the right and moral ideas, but they're also very popular ideas, then I think we can make some actual meaningful progress.
Yeah, this is kind of a problem in the spaces I exist in. So I exist in this exvangelical deconstruction space, where a lot of us only knew this right-wing entity of like Christian nationalism and Trump, and so we deconstruct a lot of the theology and even politics, and we end up just by happenstance and naturally migrating to more quote unquote democratic or progressive views. However, as I've been doing this work, there have been times where I'm like, there's a reason why I don't use the term progressive Christian anywhere, because I see some stuff where I'm like, I'm not sure if that's the take. I'm not sure if I'm a fan of what's happening in these more moderate left spaces, so to speak, but then I kind of feel stuck, right? Because I feel like, to go to our national upcoming election, I'm like, what the hell do I do? What do we do when one person might literally burn our democracy to the ground? The other person just signed another $1 billion war package for Israel, and I'm like, okay, what do we do? So I appreciate you kind of calling out, especially to my audience, the problem, right, or problems of also Democratic lawmakers who are kind of the other side of the same coin. They're still part of the military-industrial complex. They're still bought off by big oil, et cetera, to do things that are ultimately hurting not just all of our neighbors, but especially the marginalized and least of these.
Very, very well said. It's like that meme, right? That Republicans will bomb you. Democrats will slap a pride flag on the plane and bomb you. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And it's concerning. I was at an interfaith event not too long ago, and the very staunchly evangelical representative of Christianity said, "America's lost her way because we forgot Jesus." And I said, okay, let's go with that, because as a Muslim, I love Jesus too. We recognize that he was the Messiah. He was born of the Virgin Mary, that he performed miracles. We don't believe he's the Son of God, but we're pretty close on everything else.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, I love Jesus too. And so I want you to help me understand, if we forgot Jesus as Americans, when did we remember him? Was it during indigenous genocide? Was it during enslavement? Was it during Jim Crow? Was it during the Iraq War? When was it? Can you kind of point to me what that time was? And he didn't have an answer to that question. And I think that's where, this whole rhetoric of, Bible thumping or Quran thumping, whatever your scripture is, while people are suffering, it's like you miss the fundamental point of that book.
Yes.
which was service to humanity. And,
Right.
and that's kind of where, to your point earlier, Tim, about you hesitate to describe yourself as a progressive. I'm kind of in that same boat too, because I don't know what the word means anymore.
Right.
I've lost. But for me, my North Star is, if this is going to improve actual service to humanity, where people can have their right to believe or not believe as they wish, but their basic physical necessities are met,
Right.
then I'm game.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't really have any interest in doing something because I think it's moral or not. My morality is for me,
Right.
but my obligation is to ensure every person has the basic physical needs they need to survive.
I completely agree. I mean, one of the critiques we get a lot is that we're so radical. This is by like the conservatives, right? We're just radical Marxists. I'm like, guys, what is so radical about advocating for affordable healthcare in the world's richest country? What is so radical about ensuring that we have access to contraceptives and proper sex education to reduce the amounts of abortion, right? Which you guys want.
Yes.
Why is it that radical to say that maybe if you work 40 hours a week, you should be able to at least pay for a roof over your head and food for your family, right?
Sure.
Like, these are not radical ideas.
No.
Once you spell them out, and especially when you realize that other countries who are in like our bracket, I guess, have those things. Like, it's not a crazy ask. And so it is interesting because you're right. I'm like, listen, I'm not trying to be extreme here. I'm just asking, can I just have no more surprise medical bills? Like, can I not have to choose between out of network, in network? Is that too much to ask? Apparently for some people it is, and it just drives me bonkers.
There's a great book, Tim, that I think you might enjoy. It's by Jonathan Metzer. It's called Dying of Whiteness, where he's a professor who goes to these red states that refuse to expand Medicaid. Right. And he asks them why. And there's one really famous interview. He interviews a guy dying of liver cancer. And he says, why don't you get treatment? He goes, well, I can't afford healthcare. Well, why don't you support Medicaid expansion? And he flat out says, well, if I do that, then these Black and Latinos will get access too, and we'll become a socialist country. And I would rather die than become socialist.
Oh my God.
I mean, dying to own the libs is literally what he's doing there.
Right.
And it comes back to this Southern strategy, to this white supremacy. And I tell these folks who are so offended by the idea of government support, I make 2 points to them. I say, one, 9 of the top 10 states that get federal welfare benefits are conservative states. So if you're complaining about, government handouts, lead by example and reject that federal money. But you can't and won't, because you need it to survive.
Right.
And 2, are you upset about federal handouts, or is this white supremacy? Because when 270 million acres of land was given to white European peasants via the Homestead Act, you weren't complaining.
Right.
When white soldiers got the GI Bill and Black soldiers didn't, you weren't complaining.
Right.
When white families got FHA home loans for free or low interest, you weren't complaining, and Black families didn't, you weren't complaining. When legacy admissions accounts for 43% of white Harvard students, 3/4 of whom would not get admitted on merit, but you're complaining about affirmative action, there's a disparity there. I'm like, so you don't actually care about government handouts or government welfare.
Right.
You care when non-white people get access to the same thing that you're already getting access to.
Right.
And how tragic that rather than expand the table to allow more people having access to basic human dignity, you're going to cut your own nose off to spite your face. I think Jesus says something about that too.
He has a few words. I'm no scholar of religion, but he has a few words.
Just a few times, yeah, absolutely.
Hi friends, if you're enjoying this video, I have a favor to ask. The New Evangelicals is a 501c3 nonprofit, and if you've looked around at all, you've probably noticed that we don't offer member subscriptions on YouTube or Patreon options. The reason for this is very simple. It's been our mission since the beginning to offer all of our content and community resources completely paywall free. What this means is that we are completely dependent on the generosity of people like you who donate to make this work possible and accessible for all. If our content has helped you, would you consider donating to keep it all going? You can find the link in the description of this video, and to be very clear, this is not about giving to God or something like that. We're not a church and this is not a tithe. The ask is so simple. If our work has helped you, would you be willing to help us make this content accessible to more and more people? All donations made in the US are tax deductible, and every bit helps. Thank you for your generosity. I am curious for you, how much of your current work and just even your ethics are animated by your faith? Like, are you someone who practices devoutly? Like, what's the relationship there for you?
I don't know if the word devout is right in any case, because for me, it's I'm always striving to do better. I'm definitely observant in praying 5 times a day, fasting during the month of Ramadan, studying the Quran, studying all scriptures. As Muslims, we recognize all scriptures. One of the titles given to the founder of Islam, Prophet Muhammad, is that he's a title that is, he's a seal of the prophets, seal as in validation of all the prophets. And one of the reasons he's given those titles in the Quran is that he exemplifies. So I joke with my Christian friends, Christians say, what would Jesus do? Muslims say, do what Muhammad did, because he was an orphan. He was unlettered. He was poor. He was wealthy. He was a king. He was a general. He was a soldier. He had power. He didn't have power. And so he was a husband. He was a father, right? He was a grandfather. And so we look at what he exemplified in his life's situations and in life circumstances. And so when I think about this aspect of how do I apply my faith to the contemporary world, it's not a question of how do I impose my morality on Tim.
Right.
On the contrary, it's how do I reform my own morality to be an example so that Tim can look at my actions and say, hey, I want to be more like him, without me having to preach about it with my words. In Islam, there's a concept that God is most gracious, ever merciful, and that he will forgive the sins committed against God, but he will be very slow to forgive the sins committed against God's creation. And in that sense, the worship that we do as Muslims, the praying the 5 times a day, the fasting, these are all things that we do for our own spiritual development, for our own connection with God. And if there's weakness or defection in that, then God can and will forgive him. God can forgive all sins because he's God. He's master of the day of judgment. He's Lord of all the worlds.
Right.
But where we will be held to account is if my neighbor is starving and I'm spending money buying myself new cars and a bigger house while ignoring my neighbor starving. If I'm cheating the government in not paying my taxes the way I need to be paying them. If I'm cutting corners and undermining the rights of those around me. So that obligation boils down to 2 phrases in Arabic. Hukuk Allah, your duty towards God, and hukuk al-abad, your duty towards humanity. And so in my work as an attorney, in my work as a father, as a husband, that's what it boils down to, that my worship is for myself. It's for my own self-improvement. And nobody has any right to comment or to critique that. But my service to humanity it's not an option. It's an obligation. It's a responsibility for which I'll be held accountable for. So I better make sure. And one of my favorite quotes about this is from the GOAT, Muhammad Ali, who said that service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. And so my thought process is, I don't know when I'm going to go, but when I do go, I just want to make sure that my rent is paid.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think about it. I think in Matthew 25, where Jesus, similar idea of like, hey, what you do for the least of these, you did to me. And if you didn't, away to you, eternal judgment. It's pretty intense language. It's
very clear.
It's very clear. I'm with you on all that. I think, and it's really helpful. Again, so many of us, the folks that you're talking to, are in a space where they were in like this basement of evangelical fundamentalism for so long that they're just now getting kind of above ground and being like, oh my gosh, the Christian tradition is bigger, let alone other faiths and how they operate. So any chance to have people come on and share their faith perspective, what animates them, it's just so helpful for us to, again, think about the world that's bigger than just us and how we can have necessary and beautiful interfaith dialogue, learning from each other to make the world a better place, right? Because there seems to be these themes consistently of loving God, loving your neighbor, all this stuff that we go, yes, like how do we do that working on a planet, right, with tons of different religious views and cultural perspectives? How do we work together to find the common good for the sake of all of our neighbors as we move forward? I just think that is key.
Absolutely.
Arguably maybe now more than ever.
I couldn't agree more, Tim. One of my favorite stories from the life of Prophet Muhammad is when, after he makes his claim to prophethood and says that I'm that prophet foretold in the scriptures and the Torah and the Bible and whatnot. There is a Christian community in a city called Najran, not far from Mecca, and it's a prominent, known Christian community. And so they send a delegation to meet this person making this claim of prophethood. And they're meeting in his mosque and they're discussing and they're dialoguing and they're exchanging ideas. And then one day the prophet notices that they are demonstrably uncomfortable, that there's some anxiety a shift in tone. And he says, did something happen? Is something wrong? Did I say something to offend you? And the Christian delegation responds that, well, Sunday is our day of worship, and we need to find a church to go offer our worship services. And the prophet responds by saying that you're welcome to go find a church, but this mosque is a house of God, and you can worship any way you wish in this mosque. And history attests that this Christian delegation, as Christians, as devout Christians, worshipped God as they deemed appropriate in that mosque without restriction or hesitation. And so I compare that to what's happening in so many Muslim majority countries where there's restrictions on Christians worshiping, where some churches are bombed or destroyed. And I say, shame on you, because you are betraying the very fundamental principle that Islam mandates, that the Prophet himself exemplified, of ensuring there is complete religious freedom. That not only was it religious freedom, but they were allowed to preach and evangelize and do so in a way that was respectful and to the Prophet directly. How dare anyone undermine that? And that's what I go back to by my point about him being the exemplar, right? That followed that example, because in doing so, years later, there's a very famous letter written by the St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai, when they saw Islam expanding and growing, and said, what will happen if the Muslim empire takes control over our region? What will our rights be? And after this, you can go and Google the full letter yourself and read it. But the Prophet himself wrote a response, and that letter is still with us. It's in a museum in Turkey.
Wow.
And he says that Christians are my citizens, and by God, I stand against anything which displeases them. If a Christian woman is married to a Muslim man, then she must not be restricted from practicing her faith or from going to her church. In fact, Muslims are commanded to protect churches. And if a church is attacked, then Muslims themselves must defend that church and repair that church. They must not prevent the priests from going to their monasteries or from Christians from going to their worship services. I mean, he goes on and on and on, exemplifying this. And I think it goes back to this point that I was making earlier, that your worship is between you and God, but your service to humanity has to be universal. It has to be indiscriminate. Whether a person believes in God or not, their humanity is what has to shine forth. I think that's the message that an observant Christian who follows Jesus and an observant Muslim who follows Muhammad can agree upon through and through without any contradiction whatsoever.
No, 100%. I mean, we have to make room, right, for each other. You know, a key. I'm very ignorant of Islam, so forgive me. But a very big key of the Christian tradition is that every human is stamped with the image of God on them. You know, they're sacred, right?
Yep.
And so I completely agree when it comes to how other people are shaped, the religious tradition. I feel like, and I believe, it is most loving to our neighbor to make room for them and to say, listen, like we can make this work together. And I guess, be a little, use some Christianese here, but, you know, work out your own faith with fear and trembling. You know, like that's the idea, right? Is it's not on me to tell you how to practice your faith tradition and vice versa, but can we make room? And also, can we learn? And again, like I go back to, it's so weird. It's so weird growing up in an evangelical fundamentalist bubble where you're just told things that you look back now and you're like, that makes no sense, right? You're just kind of giving these really ugly caricatures. Is that my little guy? Yep. Oh, we have a 2-year-old. I love it. He's a cute one, but he's a bit of a menace. So
I love it. That's the only way a 2-year-old should be.
Yeah. Okay, easy for you to say, you know. I'm just kidding. But, you know, I was just trying to make the point that we have to work together. We have to be able to find the common good, and we can do that while learning also the beauty in each other's traditions and what we can learn from them. Yeah. The world is bigger than the basement I grew up in, and being taught these really ugly, unhelpful caricatures of other religions and just how they function has done so much damage to not only me, but my neighbor, that I've had to undo so much of that, right? To find a way to say, no, it's more complicated than these really monolithic understandings of any religious identity, not just Islam or Buddhism or anything, but it could be any of them. So, yeah.
One of the founders of my particular sect of Islam, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the founder, a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, one of the ongoing annual events that he started was an event called Religious Founders Day. And he started this with the intent that we learn about other faiths from scholars of those faiths. And so rather than me going to some anti-Christian website and learning about how evil Christianity is,
Right.
I speak to a Christian scholar and say, help me understand Christianity directly.
Right.
And what we'll do is we have these at the mosque every year, is we'll pick a topic that's kind of affects all of us, right? Like, how do we solve poverty, or how do we solve drug abuse, or how do we address alcoholism? And then each scholar is then supposed to answer that question from their own scripture as their source material.
Love that.
It's a really cool exercise.
That is cool.
Because it allows us to learn in a safe environment. Then the Christian scholar and the Jewish scholar and the Muslim scholar and the Buddhist scholar will bring their congregants together in one spot. And so everybody feels like they're in a safe space, but in a space where they can explore other perspectives. And what inevitably happens, and this is what I love, because I love seeing the light bulbs go off.
Totally.
What inevitably happens is people will listen to the Muslim scholar and the Christian scholar and the Jewish scholar and the Buddhist scholar and the Sikh scholar, so on and so forth. And they'll be like, wait a minute, that actually sounds pretty similar to what I already believe or what my scripture says as well. And so you learn this universality of humanity in these things in a very non-combative, non-confrontational way, while also authentically learning from a different perspective. And I think we absolutely need more of those in the world today.
I'm 100% with you. That's really, wow. Yeah. Maybe we'll try to make that happen digitally one day. That could be a lot of fun, doing some kind of some broad conversation with some folks. I have while we have a few minutes left, I do want to address one of the big elephants in the room, obviously, and that is what's happening in Gaza, Israel, etc. You've been very outspoken. I loved your stuff, calling it out. And honestly, as a human rights lawyer, someone who I believe is really tapped into what's going on, I'm really looking to you to kind of help me and the audience better understand just how bad things are right now, because I'll tell you, I have seen, just like you probably, way too many videos and photos of things that I cannot unsee. I'm a father, I'm a parent, I'm a husband, and putting myself in any situation like what I've seen on the internet happening in Gaza, I've wept more nights than I can count just about what I would call is the literal hell on earth happening to Palestinians right now. One of the questions that I'm always wrestling through is, like, I hear about these terms. This is a war crime. This is a crime against humanity. How are things like that? Are they enforceable? Like, is there a global, I don't know, like court where they can be like, Netanyahu, we're going to arrest you and bring you in. You got to comply. How does any accountability happen based on what we're seeing with the genocide of the Palestinians?
So there's two main international bodies here: the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court.
Okay. And
the International Court of Justice is focused on state actors. The International Criminal Court are individuals within states. And so it's an important distinction to make, right? Because the International Court of Justice couldn't prosecute Tim, right? Because Tim is he's not a state. He's not the United States, right?
Right.
But if Tim said that New York style pizza is better than Chicago style pizza, that would be maybe, some people a war crime, and the ICC could prosecute them.
I'd be found innocent, though, to be clear. I'd be found innocent. I'm just letting you know.
But that's why we have due process of law, right? So just to illustrate that. Yeah. So what's happening is the ICJ, while it does not have binding authority, it is a UN arm, and the UN has authority, provided that one of the permanent members doesn't veto it. So the ICJ has now ordered Israel to stop its invasion of Rafah. And Israel, minutes later, continued bombing Rafah.
Right.
So that if the UN Security Council wants to enforce that, they can. The United States will probably veto it, which is fundamentally the problem here, because they have veto authority. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor is a man named Karim Khan, a decorated international human rights lawyer. The ICC has authority to go after individual actors. And in this case, they're going after Hamas leadership and Israeli leadership. The conflict comes in that Israel is saying, hey, we never endorsed the ICC. And that's true, they have not. And so they're like, well, you can't hold us accountable because we never signed on to the ICC. The rebuttal to that is, well, you may not have signed on to the ICC, but Palestine has been a member state since April of 2015. And the war crimes you committed were in Palestine. And therefore, we have jurisdiction because you committed war crimes in a state that we have jurisdiction in.
Right.
And so to that end, certain countries like Germany, who, by the way, have been a staunch kind of unapologetic supporter of everything Israel is doing. Germany has said, well, now that the ICC is seeking arrest warrants, if the ICC judges approve it, then we will arrest Netanyahu the second he steps on German soil. And again, there's precedence for this, right? Russia has not recognized the ICC either.
Wait, I'm sorry. Can I interrupt you? Why would they arrest Netanyahu if they were in favor of Israel?
That's the point, right? That despite being in favor of Israel, fact that they're saying we need to recognize these internet, because we support the ICC. Germany supports the ICC.
Oh, I see.
So Germany's making the correct calculation, in my opinion, by saying that, look, whatever our personal opinions are, we signed on to the ICC. We are an ICC member. We cannot, on one hand, say we support the ICC and then suddenly not support them just because they're hitting up one of our buddies, so to speak.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And remember, Russia is also not a member of the International Criminal Court. They've rejected, jurisdiction of the ICC. But the ICC sent out and approved a arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for war crimes committed against Ukraine. And here's where the U.S. hypocrisy just comes full circle, because when that happened, Blinken came out and said, hey, we may not support the ICC, but they got this one right. They're right. And we encourage every ICC member state to arrest Putin the second he steps foot on their soil. And guess what? As a result, Putin did not attend events in South Africa, which would have arrested him. But now with Netanyahu, they're saying, oh, well, this is an outrage. This is a moral equivalence. It's a stark hypocrisy happening there right now. And so, yes, these are enforceable. But again, it's enforceable to the extent that people uphold international human rights law. The governments and heads of state uphold international human rights law. There's a great quote by the late congressman from Michigan, John Dingell, that it was the first lesson they taught us in law school, where he said that when it comes to the law, you write the substance, I'll write the procedure, and I'll screw you every single time. Right. So the law can say, that, Chicago style pizza is better than New York style pizza. But if Tim, who loves New York style pizza, gets to decide when it's applied, then the law doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happening here. The law says that the U.S. government cannot give weapons to countries credibly accused of human rights violations. The law says that. The Leahy laws are very clear on that. But if the guy in charge doesn't want to apply them, then what?
Right. Wow.
What do you do? That's where we are.
When it comes to, and I just have bits and pieces from what I've seen online, but my impression is that the UN has voted many times for ceasefires and for all kinds of things. And it seems like the US is the only nation with veto power to be saying no to these kinds of things. Is that the case, or are there other countries who are kind of with the US on how they are just, I would argue, blindly supporting Israel no matter what they seem to do? Or are we standing alone here on the world stage, or are there other people a part of this?
For the most part, you've got countries like the UK who are permanent members who are abstaining in certain situations.
Okay.
But by and large, yeah. And the thing is, there have been well over 100 UN resolutions against Israel for war crimes, for illegal invasions, for using white phosphorus, for illegal settlements, for military occupation, for indefinitely detaining Palestinian children without charge while they're suffering sexual and physical abuse. And the U.S. government continues to veto them. And that fundamental imbalance in power is, in my view, and I think in the view of many people who work in the space, not only jeopardizing the health and safety of Palestinians, but it's also jeopardizing the health and safety of Israelis and the government of Israel, or the state of Israel as well. Because when you continue to violate international human rights law over and over and over again, you make yourself a pariah. And that, I think, is the danger here, that by refusing to uphold international human rights law, you're not just harming Palestinians, you're harming the long-term security of Israel as well. And so if you truly want Israel to be safe and sovereign and secure, which I do, then you do that by ensuring it's accountable to the law. This may sound like a crude example, but if I want Tim to drive home safe and sound, I'm going to cut him off if he's drinking too much. I'm going to say, no, that's enough. Let's get you an Uber. It's the safe and logical thing to do. And the fact that we're not doing that with Israel does not bode well for long-term security or stability in the region.
My friend Daniel, he's a Christian Palestinian, grew up in Bethlehem and has family, has lost friends in Gaza. He says often to me, he's like, this is one of the best campaigns for Hamas recruitment, because this is only going to radicalize more and more. Yeah. And frankly, it's not hard to see why. And I try and tell, I deal, obviously, as you can imagine, with a lot of Christian Zionists, a lot. People who just have a theological perspective on all this that just kind of plays right into Israel's hand. And I tell them, like, if we lived in Philadelphia and there was another force that cut off all of our electricity and our water and regulated everything where we could and couldn't go, and was bombing us and was killing our children time and time again, and destroyed 60% of the neighborhoods, you're going to tell me you wouldn't be radicalized to take revenge? You're going to tell me somehow you'd be like, oh, well, if only we could stop it on our end. Of course. I mean, America almost lost our democracy a few years ago for a lot less, right? A lot less. Absolutely right. And so it's not hard to see how more violence is only going to beget more and more violence. It's only going to make people more prone to want justifiable in their mind retribution violently to break out of what my friend, again, Daniel, calls, it's not just an open air prison. He calls it a concentration camp in Gaza. He says it's open air prison is too kind of a word. And so it's not hard to see how this cycle of chaos and destruction raining hell on earth, it's not hard to see how this is only going to produce more violence in the long term. And it's very frustrating. It's very difficult.
Violence begets violence, right? Yeah. We know this. I made 3 points on October 7th.
Tell me.
The first point I made was that what Hamas did was commit war crimes.
Yeah.
Killing civilians, I don't care what form of resistance you want to define, killing civilians is a war crime.
Yeah.
I also pointed out that Hamas is a reaction to Israeli settlements and occupation for decades. I mean, for decades, and then Hamas was formed. And I said that the response to war crimes cannot be more war crimes, as well. And I had a friend who's a Zionist reach out to me and say, "Hey, I'm upset. I didn't expect you to be so critical of Israel. There was a ceasefire on October 6th." And I said, "Okay, well, let's grapple with that for a second. If I told you that in the year prior to October 6th, it was the deadliest year of Hamas killing Israeli civilians, would you consider that a ceasefire?" He goes, "No, of course not." I'm like, okay, if I told you that in the year prior, Hamas had kidnapped 1,000 Israeli children, held them in indefinite detention away from parents, legal counsel, where 80% were physically abused and at least 40% were sexually abused, would there be anything that would stop you from getting those children back? He goes, "No, of course not." I'm like, all right. Well, the opposite is true.
Yeah.
The year prior to October 6th was the deadliest year on record of IDF soldiers killing Palestinian civilians in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas. In the year prior, according to B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, Israeli, not Palestinian, not Western, not Muslim, not Arab, Israeli, reports that nearly 1,000 Palestinian children have been kept in indefinite detention, where 80% have suffered physical abuse and up to 40% have suffered sexual abuse. Those are hostages.
Right.
None of that justifies, in my view, what Hamas did of killing civilians.
Yep.
It does put it in a different context, though.
Totally.
And it does debunk the narrative that there was some kind of magical ceasefire. There was not, because those illegal settlements were still being built and the illegal military occupation was still there. I've been to the occupied territories. I've seen it firsthand. I myself was stopped at gunpoint by the Israeli military on no less than 5 different occasions and forced to show my papers or be arrested. I was forced to get off a bus at gunpoint. I was forced to delete the pictures on my phone in Palestine at gunpoint. And that's me as a U.S. citizen, human rights lawyer, traveling with Israeli former soldiers and U.S. veterans. Wow. Imagine what an ordinary Palestinian has to go through. Yeah. And as you said, when you perpetuate that violence, you're not offering a solution. You're only encouraging recruitment of more violence. And that's the reality we need to grapple with. And I'll close my rant with this. We can't just throw up our hands and say, well, then what do we do?
Right.
We know what to do. Uphold international human rights law. Stop the illegal settlements. Stop the military occupation. Let there be a sovereign Israel and a sovereign Palestine. The problem here is that the Israeli government has said very clearly, we will not have a sovereign Palestine. We will do everything possible to prevent a sovereign Palestine. They're telling us this, and they're acting accordingly. Why do we continue to fund it? That's the question that we should be asking.
I'm curious as we close, and again, I really appreciate your time. You've been just a breath of fresh air and
It's great
really
to be
great
here.
things for us to grapple with. And I hope we can at some point talk again because there's so much more to get into.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, for me, I think a lot about in my Christian tradition, there's a lot of talk of empire and kind of being on the underside of empire, how we critique
Yeah.
empire. The Apostle Paul, when he says Christ is Lord, is really a middle finger to Caesar is Lord, which was his saying at the time, right?
Yeah.
And there's this idea of some people call it being exiles in Babylon. And we think about America as a modern day empire. It is the empire. And I'm a Christian living in empire. And the teachings of Jesus are all about the underside of who that empire crushes and how we resist empire. And that's tricky for me because, we're obviously in it. We're using the technology of empire. Our phones are built off of empire. But then we see how dehumanizing the boot of empire is to other people in the world. I'm curious for you, in Islam, if there's any kind of Venn diagram overlap of how Muslims are called to live in empires like this and how we advocate for our neighbors.
Absolutely. I'm so glad. That's such a beautiful question, Tim. There's a very famous hadith, a saying of Prophet Muhammad, where he says, the greatest sacred jihad, and jihad means struggle. He says, the greatest sacred jihad is to speak truth to a tyrannical ruler. And the example that the Quran then gives of somebody exemplifying this is in Quran chapter 20, verse 43 and 44, where Moses and Aaron are instructed to go to Pharaoh and the Quran says, speak to him gently so that he may take heed, show respect so that he may take heed. That even in that situation, to a tyrannical, genocidal maniac, speak in a way that maybe it'll appeal to his heart, maybe it'll appeal to his better senses. And so, and I mean, this is Pharaoh who grew up in empire, right? This is Moses who grew up in empire, right?
Right.
And left that and then went back and spoke to that tyrannical leader, and ultimately, with the help of God, we believe, was successful.
Yeah.
And we see that exemplified in the life of Prophet Muhammad as well, that after 10 years of brutal persecution in Mecca, he and his companions didn't fight back, even though they were being killed and butchered and boycotted. They didn't rebel. They didn't, commit insurrection. They left. And they migrated a month's journey away to Medina. And then when they were attacked, they fought only in self-defense to stave off the attack. There was never any offensive attack. And then they even signed a peace treaty for 10 years to say that there shall be no more war.
Wow.
And even when that peace treaty was savagely broken, and now the Prophet Muhammad marches on Mecca with an army of 10,000 soldiers at this point. And, Stanley Lean Poole, and there's a number of Western scholars who even attest to this, who say that nobody would have blamed the Prophet for exacting revenge, for the Meccans killing his daughter, killing his grandchildren, killing his closest companions. Nobody would have blamed him for exacting retribution on the people who for 20 years brutally persecuted him to the point that his own wife died of the boycotts and starvation. But what did the Prophet do? So now you're talking about, speaking truth to tyranny or to empire.
Right.
He gave the flag of amnesty to one of his closest companions, disciples, a man named Bilal, who was an Abyssinian, described a very dark complexion, who had been enslaved, who the Prophet purchased his freedom and set him free, and had trained him to become a scholar and elevated him to the status of general.
Wow.
And he said to the Meccans that, what shall be your punishment this day? And the Meccans responded that we expect of you how Joseph treated his erring brothers. And of course, you know the story of Joseph. And the Prophet said, so shall it be. And he gave the flag of amnesty to Bilal. And he said that anyone who seeks amnesty from Bilal on this day shall be forgiven. And so he did a couple of really powerful things there. He demonstrated that true power in that situation was exercising mercy and forgiveness. And he did so by almost kind of in a very poetic way saying that the same person that you belittled and you beat and you degraded as a slave now has become the master. And now you must go to him and break down your own white supremacy and superiority complex and seek amnesty from him. And he said the conditions to stay in Mecca are, one, that you recognize these wrongs that you've done and you seek forgiveness from Bilal, not even from him, but from Bilal. And two, you recognize and respect freedom of conscience for all people. And there was one particular person who had been a particularly vehement opponent of Muslims and had fought in battles and killed Muslims. And so the Prophet enters Mecca from one side, and this guy takes off running on the other side to get to the Red Sea and escape. And his wife goes to the Prophet and says to him that you call yourself compassionate, but you wouldn't even forgive my husband. And that's why he's left. And the Prophet said, that's not true. If you were to come to ask for forgiveness, he'd be forgiven. So she chases him down, catches him as he's about to board a ship to cross the Red Sea, and says that this is the promise that Muhammad has made. You should go and fulfill it. And he comes back saying, I'm only coming back to prove that you're a fraud, that you will have me killed right away. And the Prophet says, well, you're mistaken. As long as you agree to these conditions of letting people live without oppression, then you're free to go. And that's exactly what history records and testifies to. And so in actuality, the entire life of the Prophet is how to speak truth to a tyrannical leader, and then how to actually exemplify true leadership once you are given power. It's easy to speak truth about justice when you don't have any power. The real test comes in that now that you have power to exact revenge and retribution, what do you do? And that's where we look at what Muhammad did in that situation to say that is really when the true test comes. And as Muslims, our responsibility is to lead by example, lead with compassion and justice, speak truth to power, but most importantly, when we're given power, then lead with such strict justice that even centuries later, nobody can find fault or flaw in the way we acted.
Wow. I love that. I think that is a beautiful note to end on. Qasim Rashid, I really appreciate you making time. If folks want to follow you, I mean, you're very active on social media. You say great stuff. Plug all of your channels. Where can folks follow you?
Just my name, Qasim Rashid, QASIM RASHID, across all platforms. I've got a robust Substack. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. I'm probably on the social media platform that you prefer. Right now, I am pushing folks to consider subscribing to my Substack. It's a $5 a month option, but I also have a free option for a reason, because I don't want to have any kind of paywall to any of my content. Would love to have your support. I
feel that we're a nonprofit organization. We're completely paywall free because of the generosity of donors. So that's how we do it. And I totally get it. But at the same time, we got to eat somehow, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely right.
Let's keep in touch. It's going to be a very volatile 2024, I think. And let's definitely keep the conversation going.
Privilege to be here, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.